Shalom and welcome to all our viewers and to my very good friend, Jonathan Pollard. Shalom.
Shalom.
Good to be with you once again.
Likewise.
Let's get right down to it. Yesterday, towards evening, I heard all of a sudden there was a news flash that the Hamas has accepted the hostage deal. But then within an hour or so, it became apparent that they had accepted a hostage deal that was not on the table, or rather, it is very nice. You might think, some people might think that it's wonderful news. It's not, but let's pretend it's wonderful news that they accepted some kind of a deal. But these Islamo-Nazis did not, in fact, accept any deal that was offered by Israel. It was something completely different. It was either some kind of a stunt, or it was some other kind of skullduggery that was going on. So what can you tell us? What can you tell us about that?
If I were charitable, I would call it a bait and switch maneuver on the part of Hamas. In the days leading up to this event that happened, when Hamas was portrayed as accepting the hostage deal, the Israeli Air Force initiated some very heavy aerial bombardments of Rafah, and it got their attention, Hamas's attention. Now, the deal on the table, in the most important part of the deal that Israel put on the table was that it involved the release of living hostages. Okay. And what happened was Mr. Arthur Burns, who is the director of the CIA, a Sonei Israel, a hater of Israel and Jews, got involved and facilitated a breakthrough for Hamas. And what was the breakthrough? That Hamas was not required to return just exclusively living hostages, that they could return at their discretion living or dead hostages. Now, I want you to think about this, the enormity of the betrayal by Mr. Burns and by extension the United States in this matter. Can you imagine if Mr. Burns were negotiating for the release of American hostages, which he actually is right now also, by the way, although they happen to be Jews, which means being American doesn't count for him. But if he were negotiating exclusively for American Jews with a terrorist organization, and he came along and said, you know what, we don't care if you return living Jews or dead Jews. It's up to you. It's up to you. Living or dead Americans, sorry, it's up to you.
It's all the same to us.
It's all the same to us. What would happen, he would have his career, and his career would be ended right then and there. There would be such an outcry in the United States over this kind of idea. Why? It costs a lot of time, effort, and resources for Hamas in particular to maintain living hostages. So it's much easier if you give them the out to just shoot them, kill them, and return bodies. They're given the choice, either living or dead. For the past few weeks, I've been working on a scenario with some friends of mine, consultants, military consultants, over the following scenario. The Americans work a deal out that requires the Israeli army to evacuate Gaza in return for all the hostages being released over a certain specified period of time, basically equivalent to a long ceasefire. And lo and behold, on the day that the hostages are to be released, they're all dead. Then what?
Now, I have been questioning for a very long time already how many hostages are in fact still alive.
The number that I've heard that I can count on is roughly between 20 or 22 that are surrounding Sinwar, Yamach Shimon, as human shields.
Yes, I can confirm that. I should add at this point so that our listeners hear this from someone who heard it from a very reliable source. I cannot name the source. That our special forces, Israeli special forces, have more than once in recent weeks and even months been right on the heels of Sinwar in the tunnel complexes.
Correct.
And they were faced with Sinwar's bodyguards and hostages wearing explosive vests.
Absolutely.
And therefore nothing was done. Not a shot was fired by either side, and each side retreated or withdrew. That I heard recently from a very reliable source. So they need a certain number of hostages alive to act as
correct.
live ticking bombs, but
Correct.
they don't need more than 20, shall we say.
And look, they've also admitted to holding a certain number of high-ranking Israeli army officers who have been captured during the opening phase of their invasion on October 7th. They haven't said whether they were alive or dead. They have not said that. So, okay, we should focus on the American betrayal, but it goes beyond that. Why? Because it now seems that the Americans have brokered yet another aspect of this Hamas hostage deal. And what does that include? As you know, there were a large number of terrorists who had been released under the Shalit deal, the Gilad Shalit deal, under Bibi Netanyahu many years ago, who reoffended.
In other words,
now,
having been released from prison,
having been released,
convicted of terrorist activities, they were released,
blood on their
and then
hands.
they immediately, or very in short order, they attempted to do the
reoffend.
same.
They reoffended. So now, apparently, according to the Americans, it would be appropriate for Israel, after I think the 22nd day of a ceasefire, to start a wholesale release of these people. So basically, they get 3 bites at the apple. They committed a horrible crime to begin with. They were in prison. Then under the Shalit deal, they were released, and then they reoffended, and then they were re-imprisoned. And now the Americans want them released for a third time.
Perhaps so third time lucky, no?
Yeah, this time they'll, chas v'shalom, God forbid, really kill a lot of us. So here you have 2 instances of why we never should have gotten involved with hostage negotiations, number 1, but more importantly, involving as intermediaries Qatar and Turkey and the United States. All of them have their own agendas, and not one of those agendas is designed to help us at all. Qatar basically wants to be seen as a positive influence, not a terrorist supporting state, a positive influence in terms of resolving this hostage situation. Turkey, of course, has its own, under Erdogan, has its own agenda. And this week, or last week rather, Bezalel Smotrich, in the wake of a Turkish member of what we call jihadi tourism. These are Turks that come in under a special program by the Turkish government to basically create trouble, mostly in East Jerusalem, but also in the Shomron, in Samaria.
Great trouble, and if possible, kill some Jews.
And one of them tried this time, tried to stab to death a border patrolman in the old city. Luckily, he didn't succeed and he was shot to death. Well, Bezalel basically told Bibi, why are you, and then Erdogan imposes a trade embargo. Now, this is a country supposedly involved in hostage negotiations from us. Wow. You really want a country like that involved with this? Whose side do you think they'll be on? So Bezalel wrote a very reasoned letter to Bibi saying,
let me just point out to people who you're talking about. Some people do not know who Bezalel is. You're referring to Mr. Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister.
Correct.
Yes.
head of the religious
Head
Zionist
of
party.
the religious Zionist party, yes.
Right. And he said to Bibi, this is not reasonable anymore. You have to get rid of the Turks. Just get them away from the hostage negotiations. Bibi has yet to respond to this very reasonable suggestion by Mr. Smotrich. And then you have the Americans. Look, I can't make this up. When you have the head of the CIA writing the terms for Hamas that basically devalue the lives of the hostages. I mean, we never should have involved them. In fact, I was opposed, as everybody I guess knows by now, I was completely opposed to any negotiation for the hostages. The only objective we should have had, and we still should have, is the total annihilation of Hamas. That should be our objective. If we can rescue some hostages in the process, well and good. But the Americans and the left in Israel have basically succeeded in reorienting our objectives to hostage negotiations and humanitarian relief, which has never been done in the course of, to my knowledge, human history before, where a country that was invaded, fighting for its life, had to then support the enemy population. Okay, so there was a very interesting analogy that was given to me today, in fact, by a man that I have as much respect for as I have for you, Rav. His name is Brigadier General Ofer Winter, and he was just basically expelled from the army.
Israel's greatest fighting general.
Finest
perhaps the best, the greatest of all time.
Perhaps.
Certainly one of the best.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, a religious Jew.
Terribly unfortunate.
And an officer that believes in the
which of course means a number of things. It means, A, he understands that we're at war. He understands we're at war with people who are Islamo-Nazis, and he understands that such people need to be destroyed. And he, as a fighting general, is more than happy to do that. And that's exactly why the IDF, with the capital D for defense, which doesn't belong there, the American army is not called the American
The British Army is
it's called the British Army. The American Armed Forces is not a defense force. We can certainly not afford a defense force. We need to be a very much offensive and initiate and conclude hostilities as quickly as possible. So that's why he's not been promoted. He was never promoted in the army beyond brigadier general. And now he's been shown the way out.
Right, General Brick. And I'll come round to the hostages again on this, his relevance to that. General Brick, who was a Cassandra, if you will, of this disaster that happened on October 7th, wrote an assessment of Brigadier General Winter. And to boil it down to its essence, he said that if he had been in command of the Southern Front,
he being Brigadier General Winter, yes.
Winter had been, rather than General Finkelman, Brigadier General Finkelman, Hamas never would have crossed the border. And coming from a person as cynical as Brick is, that's high praise indeed.
And secular, and not necessarily even very right-wing.
Very right-wing, but secular. So what I talked with Brigadier General Winter today, and he made a statement about the hostages that just absolutely rocked me in its simplicity. And what was that? He said to me, Jonathan, go back to the days of the Yom Kippur War, when the Egyptians initially captured many soldiers along the Bar-Lev line, the defensive line that we had built along the Suez Canal. He said, what would have happened back then if the Israeli government and the high command had said, we have to stop the war to negotiate for the return of our POWs. Think about that. What would have happened? And I thought about it. I mean, it stunned me for a second. And I said, we would have lost the war. The Egyptian army would have been ensconced on the high ground, the passes in Sinai, Western Sinai, the Gidi, Mitla, and Katima passes. And we would have had to negotiate from a position of inferiority, weakness. And they would have said, quite plainly, you want your people back? Get out of Sinai. And he said, yeah, that's right. That is exactly what happened just now. But he said, you could imagine what would have happened back then. But he said the consequences today of such thinking are as bad for Israel's deterrence as it would have been back then if that illogic had been used. So getting back again to the hostage situation, I know a lot of people don't like me to say this, but the fact of the matter is I'm sick and tired of the media in Israel beating this drum over the hostages. Why? First of all, the number of hostage families that are calling for surrender, if you will, is a distinct minority of the hostage families. Most of the hostage families are saying win. Israel l'netzach, Israel to victory, win. Or they're trying to stop, quote, humanitarian aid from entering Gaza until our hostages, if there are any alive, are well treated. At least if we have signs of life, something. There has to be some reciprocity. But throughout this entire ordeal, I want to just turn to the Americans right now. They haven't given a darn about the welfare of either our hostages, some of whom are American citizens, or all the displaced Israelis from the north and south. They don't appear anywhere. So we have in our tradition, and you can speak to this far better than I can, as a matter of halacha, we are not allowed to pay an exorbitant price for hostages, lest it encourage the taking of hostages by our enemies. It's very simple.
Absolutely. In our case, it's even worse, because the halakha, the Jewish law, formulated, shall we say, roughly 2,000 years ago, referred to a very different type of situation. At that time, in the Mediterranean, shall we say, there were many pirates whose line of business was simply to kidnap people on the high seas or from some port of call and ransom them. That was their business model.
Mm-hmm.
And it was well known throughout the Greco-Roman world. The Romans, at some points in history, fought this phenomenon quite successfully by
Julius Caesar and
yes,
Pompey.
Specifically, yes. They pretty much shut that down for some time. But it was a well-known phenomenon. And therefore, not only Jews, but all people at that time living in those areas had to consider, what would you do if your family member, someone from your community, from your town, was kidnapped and was up for ransom now. Now, because this was a common practice, there was a market. There was a market price, right, for a fit male captive from the age of, shall we say, 20 to 40. The price was X, and for something else it was Y, and for a female Z, whatever it was, there was a market price. There was a going rate. So the Jewish sages, the Chachamim, Hazal, said that you are allowed, if you're able, if you have the means, you're allowed to, the community, it's a community question, it's not a private matter, because it impacts the entire community. If
Correct.
you have the means, you can ransom your captives from your town, from your area, those that you're able to help and to ransom at the going rate, but not more than the going rate, because if they discover that Jews will pay more than the going rate, more than others will pay, then of course they'll just drop all the others and they'll concentrate on kidnapping Jews, and that will simply exacerbate the situation. and put more Jewish lives at risk.
In danger.
But Chazal never spoke about how you proceed when you are in a state of war with these people. These people were not at war with the Jews. They were just business people, so to speak.
But we had a precedent for that.
It's like the mafia, right? Like the mafia.
Yeah, but we have a
we have nothing
precedent.
against you personally. This is just business.
No, it's not personal. It's just business. But
Right.
we have precedents. And we've talked about this with Avram Avinu and Lot,
Yes,
with
that's
David
right.
Melech and Ziklag, that
Right.
situation, with Shechem, with Shimon and Levi, when they went and took vengeance against what happened to their sister Dinah. We have precedents for how we're supposed to deal with hostages. And we've lost our minds right now, mostly due to the weakness of our leaders and our army, our political leaders and our army, and the connivance of the hard left by using this hostage crisis to undermine Bibi's credibility as a war leader. Because what's going to happen is, at the end of the day, my prediction is, no matter how this hostage situation resolves itself, they will use this. I've seen it already in Tel Aviv, a poster with the bloody hand, which is what the Palestinians use against us. But this picture of a bloody hand with Bibi's face behind it, telling him he's the murderer of the hostages. No matter how this ends, they've politicized the whole hostage issue, and they've basically weaponized the hostage issue for Hamas. That's the unintended maybe consequences, but they should have known this would happen. Weaponized it for Hamas and the United States.
That's not important from their perspective.
But for the left, it's not important.
But then this is BDS. This is Bibi derangement syndrome. That's what it is. In other words, everything is subservient to the ultimate goal of bringing down the fall of Netanyahu, which we shall speak about also. It should be clear, neither of us are great fans of Benjamin Netanyahu.
No,
that does not justify or excuse the behavior of those traitors and our various enemies.
They are traitors. They should be arrested for sedition. I mean, they're attempting by other means a coup d'etat right now. They have ever since the anti-judicial reform protests started. And now they just latched on to the hostage issue as just another cudgel to use against Bibi and his government.
That is certainly true. Although I will point out that their attempts to execute a coup d'etat and engineer regime change did not begin with the so-called judicial reform that never got off the ground. It began way back in 2013, according to the Gregorian calendar, Tafshin Pei Ayin Gimel, when they began to drum up all kinds of false charges and create
a narrative, a false narrative.
Began to engage in lawfare against Netanyahu based on nothing. All those various charges are, as we speak, unraveling in court. But of course, the Israeli media, most of the Israeli media, who are unprofessional and un-Jewish, non-Jewish in every respect, they don't even speak about what's going on in the courts, because it's uncomfortable for them to admit that everything's falling apart. All the cases against him supposedly are all being shown to have been cobbled together very, very unprofessionally. Completely.
Look, there was a long opinion piece in the Jerusalem Post by their new deputy editor-in-chief. It was so bad. This was about the hostage situation, where she made up out of, like, it was creatio ex nihilo charges against the Bibi's administration of threatening the leftist hostage family organizations and their members, that if they didn't be quiet and get with the program, their family members that are being held hostage would be put down on the list of priorities of the ones to be released. I mean, what is this based on? Where's the proof for this? And she just said it as if it were gospel, if you will. And it just went on in this vein. And I just thought to myself, there will be a day of reckoning. There will be a day of reckoning when the Israeli media, in particular this past week, Khan Reshet Bet, was banging the drum. Everyone they interviewed was in favor of a hostage release at any cost. I mean, it was horrible to listen to. It was pure propaganda. The day is coming when there will be retribution against these editors, the deputy editors, the reporters, the organizations themselves, for aiding and abetting an enemy in time of war. Of course, they would say this is all about free speech. Well, unfortunately, the left has also weaponized free speech, in which they're free to say whatever they want, while we are not. So on the issue of the hostages,
free speech for them and no speech for us.
And no speech for us. If you look at the issue of the hostages, again, the media has been the handmaiden, not just of the left, but of Hamas and their fellow travelers in the encampments in the United States, in Europe, university encampments in Europe, in the United States, and the American government, the Biden administration. There are few newspapers in Israel that I would consider balanced, reasonable, and dare I use the word, patriotic. And the Jerusalem Post, and certainly Haaretz, and Yediot Achronot, and all the rest of them, they're as bad as Al Jazeera as far as I'm concerned. And if they're going to close Al Jazeera, and that's a whole other story, they closed it. They ought to start thinking about closing Haaretz as well, and others of the other newspapers of their ilk. So all of this has come to a head on this issue of the hostages. And ironically, what is never reported, you'll never see it on CNN or on the New York Times or any other mainstream media outlet, the fact that the overwhelming majority of Israeli people, of our citizens, want Israel lenetzach. They want an Israeli victory, period. And if we can get the hostages out in the course of that campaign, Baruch Hashem, thank God, well and good. But nobody will talk about this. I have sent so many polls to people I know in the media establishment in the United States, for example, and I don't even get a response. Nothing. There's a narrative that has us losing the war. And unfortunately, the hostages and the poor Palestinians don't exist. The Arabs living in Gaza that need all this humanitarian assistance. These are the weapons that are being used against us now. This blood libel, for example, of there being a famine in Gaza.
Quite the opposite.
They don't know what to do with all the food.
There is a surplus of food. Everything is being tossed away. It's rotting.
It's rotting. Between the hijacking by Hamas and the misadministration of the distribution of the food by the UN, what does the Biden administration do? They blame us. We're starving Arabs to death.
Yes, but that, of course, gains votes in Dearborn.
Well, the two-state solution, Dearborn and New Jersey, as far as the
Michigan and New Jersey.
Michigan and New Jersey. So, again, in conclusion, this week has really ripped the mask, if you will, off the ulterior aims of not just the CIA, but the Biden administration. It basically told Hamas, you can kill all the hostages if you want, and it's part of the deal. They've said you can release for a third try, all of the murderous terrorists.
Yes, understood. So what do you predict will happen now with regards to this outrageous talk about so-called deal?
I think once people in Israel assimilate what actually has happened, I don't expect this to be brought to be discussed even overseas. Let's just talk to the local situation. I think when Israelis, our people, suddenly understand the perfidy, and that's the word I use for it, the perfidy of what the CIA and the Biden administration has just done by devaluing the lives of Jews who happen to be hostages. I think there's going to be a tailwind behind the drive to just reduce ashes at whatever cost to the voluntary human shields that are protecting Hamas. That is what I would like to see happen. Whether it happens or not, we'll have to just wait and see. But that's what should happen. If we had a prime minister worthy of the name, he should quote Shakespeare and just say, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war and just annihilate.
Well, that of course is what should have been the official aim of the war from day one. From day one.
Day one.
I will say more than that. I was asked recently when I received this information about the Jewish hostages wearing explosive vests surrounding Sinwar in the tunnels. What is the halachic response to that situation in terms of waging war against the enemy? In other words, do you prosecute such a situation militarily, knowing that these hostages will unfortunately be killed? Or do you withdraw because you do not wish these hostages to die? And I said, with a heavy heart, that no question in my mind, according to halakha, according to Jewish law, and according to common sense, and I think every country in a similar situation has behaved in this way, because there is no other way to prosecute war against such a satanic enemy.
Correct.
They have to be viewed as soldiers in a war. They perhaps did not ask to be soldiers, but they've been turned into soldiers by our enemies. And we must unfortunately treat them as soldiers. That is to say, that their lives cannot come before the welfare and the future of the Jewish people. That is why we are able to send soldiers to war in the first place.
Hamas has been very clear. Our enemies have been very clear in stating that every Jew, whatever age, they consider a soldier. A baby in a crib and an elderly person in a wheelchair, doesn't matter to them. And this is why, unfortunately, we all here, and I've expressed this to audiences, we all have to consider ourselves to be soldiers. And that if our lives are going to be forfeit, so be it. That's the way it works against this kind of inhuman enemy. Rav, I've never really said this to anybody before, but there were many occasions where I was told, when I was in prison, I was told by Israeli diplomats and intelligence officers that the price that America was asking for me was too high. Okay. And I accepted that. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Say that my life was more important than the old city of Yerushalayim, or the Golan Heights, or the Maharat HaMachpelah? I was glad, in fact, that the Americans put my life at such a level that I was able to say, no, I won't be party to this. Not that the Israelis would have included me anyway, even if I'd said yes. But I've been in that position. I was in that position for 30 years, where I was constantly told the price asked for your freedom is simply too high. So I know what I'm talking about when I make the statement that in this case with the hostages, their release, the terms and conditions of their release is simply too high. I've been there. I have the right to say that because I've been in that position. And all these leftists on the street bleeding how we're a nation that cares for its people. Yes, we are within boundaries and within measures. So I still hold the position that on October 8th, nothing should have been standing in Gaza, from Gaza City in the north to Rafah in the west. It should have been a field. That's how you live in this jungle known as the Middle East. This is not fought by the Marquess of Queensberry rules in this neck of the woods. This is medieval in the worst sense of that word. So, and we have halacha to back us up, and that's enough for me.
I could not agree more.